We are excited to have this panel. We are coming into the home stretch, and I am honored that these three individuals have decided to join us this afternoon. Toby Culshaw, Courtney McMahon, and Jordan Pettman, Philips, Colgate, and Nestle, respectively. And we'll have them come up in a minute. As they do, I want to introduce the topic of talent intelligence and how it's affecting everything from the nature of the relationship that we have with workers to workforce planning and the underlying data. So welcome, you three. Good to see you, however, from afar.
Thanks, Al.
Hi.
Hi. Making this happen. So if we would, we'll go around the horn. Toby, you want to introduce yourself? And we'll go with Courtney, and then Jordan, if you bring us home, that would be great.
So Toby Culshaw, I lead talent intelligence over at Philips. So we've got a team split between the UK, Netherlands, and India. And we do talent intelligence across the breadth of Philips. So Royal Philips has been going through a lot of change, transformation. And yeah, we cover pretty much every angle from a pure talent intelligence perspective.
Outstanding. Courtney?
Yes, thanks, Al. Courtney McMahon. I just started actually this month at Colgate. So I'm just figuring out what the team will look like, what we'll be focusing on. Held a similar role at AIG. Got into this space when I was at Deloitte back in 2013. Started in the organizational psychology space, and happy to have all of these different perspectives in the people analytics space, including organizational psychology.
All right. Thanks for being here. Jordan?
Hi, everyone. Jordan Pettman. I'm leading people analytics at Nestle globally. So like Courtney, I've got kind of a broad remit looking at lots of things like data standards and business intelligence through analytics across the whole of the HR spectrum, as well as things like some of the strategic planning where we have quite a bit of overlap into that talent intelligence space.
Well, Jordan, we come back to you in a minute because we've been in the space quite a number of years. Both worked with the Inform Group way back when. So, I want to get your perspective on where we've evolved. But before that, this whole defining what talent intelligence is, Toby, this has been a focus of yours. So, if you would just kick us off with, what does talent intelligence mean to you?
Yeah, so I guess there's a broad definition, which is something around applying external data to people's skills, competitors, geographies, anything around that to drive business decisions. So it's very much that external data perspective. I think the fun of it comes with how that's actually run through in companies, and we're seeing very different takes on talent intelligence, very different models, very different structures, very different reporting lines, depending on how organizations are set up and how they're using that data to drive a business decision. But it's all around that external data.
So Jordan, I want to go to you because when we first started in this field, the idea that we had external market data on talent moving from organization to organization, where supply demand relationships were going to be externally, was a heavy lift. It wasn't readily available. So, how are you using it? And how do you define it?
Yeah, I mean, all those years ago, it was hard work, hey? Like the running an external labor market analysis as part of a workforce planning project was a big research undertaking. And I think fortunately today, as with so much that's been supported by technology changing in recent years, it's a far more approachable area of strategic planning, certainly for us. I think it's interesting a little, particularly at an organization like Nestle, where we are in quite so many locations and in locations that aren't necessarily the capital cities of anywhere, looking at external labor market analysis to enrich some of the strategic planning that we might do has been it's still a little bit tough, right? Like if Nestle is the large or in fact only employer in a particular place, the talent intelligence that you can get from the external labor market can still be a bit sticky. This said, like we are finding our ability to influence thinking about cross-geographical, like functional teams being far greater now that we can start to look at the way that skills and capabilities exist across broader geographies than perhaps our business is in. And that's certainly a much more straightforward process than it was all those years ago. But again, it's sort of, it's both us and our recruiting space as well. You know, we tend to think a little bit more long term and about where we might be able to find these skills as part of strategy. But then actually executing on that and finding the skills and finding that talent is a different story altogether.
Yeah, and we're going to come back to this skills idea because, you know, obviously the world has changed over the past few months, and talent intelligence was emerging as a key asset, key piece of insight for recruiters and workforce planners. Yet now we're shifting and morphing organizations, and this talent intelligence, this labor market analytics, is still of high value. It's just going to be used arguably in different ways. So, Courtney, going to you. Obviously, you mentioned at the outset that you're new there at Colgate. When you came in, I imagined you had a roadmap, a vision, and I imagine it's adjusted over the last couple months. Where do you see talent intelligence and looking at the external environment be in terms of your priorities moving forward?
Yeah, that's what I'm currently thinking about. And so I was happy to be on this panel to learn from the other panelists, actually. But of course, I've had to think about it myself. And I've always thought about talent intelligence as an external plus internal. And I guess it's because I come from the people analytics space. I just can't see it without the internal data matching up. I think we are still figuring out how to harness the power of recruiting data. So that's something I'm currently tapping into, of course, at Colgate. I think recruiting is traditionally a reactive group, not as strategic, right, as maybe other organizations within HR. So how do we move there? And I think talent intelligence is obviously one of those paths. But how does that differ from workforce planning, and where should it sit in the organization? Obviously depends on who's leading, right? So I think that's something that's under consideration for me. Where is workforce planning, and is it embedded versus is it central?
Yeah, it's a great question, and we kind of have a loop going, and we'll just run with it. Toby, and this was actually going to be my follow-on question, is ideally we have pieces of insight that land to an internal audience that in turn is going to take action. And that implies, to Courtney's point, that there was a workforce planning process in place prior to COVID-19. Even if there wasn't, or even if there was, it probably wasn't moving as fast as is required now, almost definitely. So now we have these task forces being spun up, and this idea of talent intelligence is being elevated in terms of not only visibility, but hey, where are the cases that are out there that might put our workforce at risk? Should I be thinking about moving from one location to another? So again, Toby, where does it sit in your organization in terms of the workflow? If you're generating insight or curating it, where does it go? What audience does it hit? Is it a governance group that's been already in place, or is it something that's just been created recently?
Yeah, great question. So for us, it's very much around who are the decision makers. So we sit within TA, but we face very much off to the business. We have a strategic arm within TA. So we've got TA business partnering that's evolving. So we do have an arm, a route in there, but the vast majority of our work goes straight out to the business. And the work we're doing, it's very much dependent on what we're going through as a business. So yes, COVID, huge issue. We're obviously as a business heavily invested in that ventilated space. So we need to rapidly bring talent intelligence to the table, so that when we are looking to ramp up that production, for example, we know where we're going to get this talent from. We know what the talent landscape looks like. We know what we need to change. But I think even more so with Philips specifically going through so much transformation overall, so shifting from hardware to software, product to solution sales, etc. We're going through such a pivotal phase that overall as an organization, we have a real desire and hunger to understand what good looks like in the external market, what is feasible and viable in the external market. So our routes to the decision makers, it's very direct and it's very, very short. So generally our work is looking at the C-suite and their direct reports, and it's looking at that kind of 12-month to 36-month window. We don't generally get pushed too much further than that, purely because the world is changing so fast and so dramatically that beyond that, I think you're kind of getting a bit optimistic, to be honest. I think that kind of 36-month window, you can start being more feasible of, look, that's what we can really settle on. That's what we can plan our real estate plans on, our location decisions, our organizational structure, etc. Beyond that time frame, I think things change too fast.
Yeah, agreed. And for you, Jordan, who's your audience? Same question. I mean, is a workforce planning process already stood up, or now are you using this insight around talent markets differently?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of an evolving space for us, actually. Workforce planning is certainly something that we've had in place for a number of years now. It's embedded to our business planning processes. And so our business leaders are used to engaging in thinking about the resources and the skills and the people that they will need, both in the next kind of 12, 18 months and then through to a longer period of time. I think right now, some of the discussion that we're having in this space is shifting, and the people that we're having these discussions with are shifting as well. Typically, our planning stuff would happen in a business, like out in one of our markets, and a lot more of the discussion that we're having now is reacting to the environment that we're in. What does the new normal look like? So people that might used to have regularly traveled previously, even as local restrictions are lifted, as the waves of COVID sort of settle down a little. If we're still going to have quarantine, then going on that 1 week business trip is probably not feasible if you've got to do 2 weeks of quarantine on either end of it. So what does the new look? What does new normal look like now? How do we find those people that are actually really well suited to working in this new way of working, which might not look like what it used to look like and might have a big impact on our culture? And I think that discussion is shifting some of the audience away from being out in the markets to a more centralized point to start thinking about those bigger macro impacts.
Yeah, and obviously it's a time that we're having those types of discussions around the macro impacts, and there's so much uncertainty. So, Courtney, going back to you, and you mentioned this holistic view, internal, external. As you focus on your internal customers there, who would you like to consume this insight, and what type of action would you like them to be taking, particularly given what's happening with COVID-19? I mean, Jordan started to touch on it, but what are your thoughts there? I mean, what would be the ideal future state for the use of this type of insight?
Yeah, I think it's so interesting what Jordan just said about, are the same people who were suitable for our roles before the same people now, right, in the new normal? And I think that we're all going to have to shift to even new people, new entries, right, into the job market who are not at their old jobs because their old jobs are no longer there. We actually have a new pool to draw from. So how do we analyze that pool, figure out where they could fit in our organization? Because there's obviously millions of talented people out there who weren't available before. And I think working with internally talent acquisition is obviously my first stop, but then also the business leaders. I need to hear from them regarding what could work, right? What do they have now that they want to build on? And obviously, as Toby said, there's only so far in the future we can look. So how can we be realistic about what we're looking for in the next 6 to 12 months with what we know?
Yeah, it's the case where, as we talk about, this is the term that I use, talent market analytics. So talent intelligence, talent market analytics. And the way that insight is generated is people are sharing their data. Hopefully they're sharing it consciously. Sometimes they might not just be aware because they click, agree. And there are ethical repercussions to that. And now we're consuming this data, taking action on it. However, there is a positive outcome for the individual. That's the reason this data has become, widespread, both in terms of its use. LinkedIn probably being the best example, but there are many organizations now that are offering tools that enable this insight to be generated. So, Toby, can you speak to the ethical repercussions? Because ethics has been a key theme, not only throughout today, but over the last 2.5 days. What do you think about this, and what action are you taking, if any?
Yeah, I think it's the ethics around data. Obviously, we heard about it in the conversation just now with Andy, etc. I think it's a really hot topic, and I think it's something that's really important from a TI stance, particularly because there's a lot of data out there that people aren't aware is out there, and there's a lot of platforms out there that have very differing stances on what's ethical from a data perspective, and if it's out there, you can go for it. Which I think isn't necessarily the case. And I think particularly if you're looking at that GDPR layer that's getting interpreted very differently from different vendors. You have a whole layer where you're starting to look into talent acquisition data, when you're looking into interview notes, for example, or into candidate CVs that have applied. You have to be very, very careful. You have to be very careful about what you're doing, why you're doing it, and what's appropriate. And I think as much as possible, we take the stance of all the work we do, we step back from that GDPR layer and essentially say we're looking at anonymized data, we're looking at functional level org charts, for example. We're looking, so depending on the work we're doing, we always try to take that step back away from anything that's going to identify individuals, anything that's going to lead us to having any kind of ethical dilemma, because it's generally, we find that the decisions you're making, you don't need that layer of granularity. By the time you're getting to kind of the individual level, you're getting more towards operational recruitment intelligence anyway, which isn't something my team do. So I think overall there's something we really need to be aware of. I think there's a broader piece around the source, particularly the sourcing, the headhunting side of things. There's lots of grey areas still. There's lots of grey areas around data acquisition, whether you're looking at OSINT tools or whether you're looking at just old school, picking up the phone, going through gatekeepers and finding out people's mobile numbers. That there's almost a game to it, and I think that there needs to be a bit of a shake-up in terms of the broader TA industry, in terms of what do we do around data ethics, how seriously are we taking this, and how are we using data. I think GDPR is a step in the right direction, but I think there's probably more needs to be done.
Yeah, and as we segue over to you, Jordan, I'd like to put a bit of a different layer on it, and hopefully it resonates with you. If not, you by all means answer it in the way you see fit. Is that the contract between the employer and the employee has shifted, and it always does based on the macro economy. So we just got through a 10-year run where particularly key talent were in huge demand, and so they could dictate the terms. There's a lot of power for the worker. Now, many people are scared for their jobs. And, so arguably the propensity for an individual to market themselves through these platforms has gone up significantly. So, how does that factor in, if at all, and how you're going to use this data? Is this going to be something that, gosh, if I think about the morphing workforce, I'm going to use even more? Or is it, hey, I'm not going to use this right now because I have to focus on the people who are already, in my organization, and that data is a distraction? I mean, any thoughts there?
It's actually quite a poignant question, Al, because I've got a couple of roles in my team that I'm looking to fill like right now. And one thing that Nestle is we're pretty proud of, actually, is culturally we're an our people first kind of organization. So, for sure, in these sorts of times, of course, we're going to try to fill as many roles as we can from within, and offer the opportunity to develop into new roles and new careers to our own people. I think the advances and changes in technology generally, and our thinking about data, particularly through GDPR in the last couple of years, kind of I think it's creating an interesting dichotomy between the individual and an organization in terms of the roles and responsibilities that we have about the creation and use of data. I think for my team and certainly for the rest of Nestle, we have some pretty well spelled out ethical approaches to the use of personal data, whether that's our employees or consumers. Like we have a big cross-functional group of people that sit on governance committee to look after that sort of stuff. So I represent HR there. So I think from a typical compliance point of view, we're kind of okay. But I think to your point, as people are more prone to create data about themselves, if they are increasingly anxious about their roles, we do need to be a little bit more critical of the sorts of vetting that we do when we're looking at those kinds of data sources. I think when we were preparing for the podcast, we were talking about an earlier podcast that David had done with Yvette Cameron, I think her name was, at Next Gen Insights. She was talking about how blockchain as a concept and as a technology would really impact the idea of the ethical use of data, particularly in the recruiting space. Because in theory, a blockchain is created between myself and any of the employers that I have, and we can each change the data that we own about me in that blockchain. And as the owner of that data, ultimately, I can share or not share what's in it. I think the accountability to an individual to have correct data available through the TA process, I think, is becoming a little bit greater because there is the ability to get into far more granular detail from an organizational point of view. I think it's a really interesting and evolving area of discussion. I wouldn't like to think that we have all of the answers yet.
Yeah, I agree. It's interesting, and I agree we don't have the answers. And I also believe that it's imminent. In my view, that we are going to get to a point in some near future that individuals own at least a greater proportion of the data that's going out into the public view, as well should be the case from an ethical social responsibility perspective, at least in my view. So, Courtney, how are you thinking about the use of data around the market and how individuals are going to have the propensity to share it or not share it? Are you giving this much thought, or is that not a priority quite yet?
It's probably not a priority, but I've definitely given it thought. And based on, Jordan, what you said about accountability of the individual to really make their publicly available data accurate is key. There are many vendors. One of them is Claro, where you can aggregate, but also drill down to labor market data about your own company, your competition, by job title, but also by skill. You can get very granular. And I was thinking about it for myself just because I need certain skills. Job titles can be misleading. And that is something that I think there's a, catch-22. You're looking at individuals, and is that ethically sound? Okay, it's publicly available. Is that something that, is part of talent intelligence? Probably not, but it's certainly part of recruiting, right? And it's a tool that can really catapult recruiting based on how accurate the data is, right, into a more efficient and effective space.
Well, yeah, I want to take that and take it to a future state where we have all this data, potentially blockchain, but the reality of COVID-19 and as we move forward in time is that if we echo in any way what happened in 2008, 2009, organizations contracted, yet the rebound happened pretty quickly, yet they did not hire in line with the work. But that work was done by other people. It was done by outsourced providers. It was done by contractors. It was automated. So how the organization is actually designed arguably is going to change. And it can change because, one, it needs to. Number two, we have more insight into the options. So my question to you, Toby, gig economy. AI, outsourcing, all these things are options by which to get work done. Is that something that you are looking at personally, or you at Philips are systematically addressing?
Yeah, so there's a couple of answers there. So we have a whole team here and a whole platform built around looking at our total workforce. So not only the permanent headcount, but also the contingent and non-permanent workforce, but also using external data to model against that, so we can see how that compares to the external labor market. So we do quite a lot around what is the appropriate shape of our workforce from permanent, contingent, gig, whatever it may be. I think it's going to change in a number of ways looking forward. I think the fascinating thing is I don't think we know which direction it's going to go in. So I was talking to somebody earlier this week around the fact that with this whole COVID situation, they were saying, it's really going to push the gig economy further, because suddenly people need that flexibility, that they want multiple options, that they want that fluidity in their career even more so now. The flip side of that is a lot of people I've been talking to have been saying, well, actually, it could go the other way, because suddenly people are thinking, well, we want that security net that a larger enterprise organization could potentially give. The counter, once again, is you can see a lot of large enterprise organizations where that hasn't been a safety net. So I think that it's a really fascinating time where there's so much moving, there's so many moving pieces that we just don't know. And I think that's where talent intelligence is really going to come in. It's not necessarily purely the large aggregated data sets that are relatively stable. It's the smaller, more dynamic changes. How are things going to be impacted by real estate movements? If organizations suddenly say they don't need a big office anymore and people are going to work remotely, how's that going to impact? Suddenly people are going to want larger houses to have an office at home, so the salaries are going to go up. So the return on investment from smaller retail space, you're going to lose that in the salary. How does that change in terms of your permanent headcount? Do you suddenly then look at flexible working? Do you look at outsourcing, etc.? So I think it's all going to change dramatically. I think your point to AI, automation, etc., I think that's going to be a big piece. I could see post-COVID more companies using this as an opportunity to reevaluate their ways of working and see what they need to do manually, what can they automate, RPA, etc. And then obviously the knock-on of that also being, what do we need onshore, offshore, remote? So I think, yeah, it's a bit of a politician's answer, but every angle you look at, I think there's going to be a lot happening and a lot changing.
So, yeah, how about you, Jordan? This notion of total workforce and looking how this is going to ebb and flow, gig economy, employees, outsource providers, AI. Are you looking at it holistically as well?
I mean, I think we certainly try to in the context of our workforce planning. So yes, I think a lot of what we're trying to do at the moment is to understand kind of what impact we're going to have on our existing workforce. I'm sure it's not groundbreaking for anyone looking at things like the ONET data and understanding of the current workforce, like what automation is happening, and helping to understand the skills adjacencies of the jobs that we have versus the jobs that are likely to exist in the future as the way that we work changes. I think a lot of the discussion that we've started to have internally in my team, and certainly a little bit broader into the business as well, is, what do we need to start thinking about in our planning cycles to account for the changes that are happening now? What do we need to start thinking about in terms of the workforce that we have now, the skills that they have now? What skills do they need to be developing so that they can take roles in whatever this new look world will be, if in fact the world drastically changes? Maybe it won't. I think that's the fantastic piece, I think, around pulling more data and more options into this planning cycle, is that we really don't know. Well, we've never known, right, what was going to come in the next 3 to 5 years. There was always an element of crystal ball gazing that made us all a little bit uncomfortable in workforce planning. I think that the talent intelligence space and the application of more options and more data about if we went down this path, the so what for our workforce, the so what for our business execution is X versus Y. I think we have far more opportunity now to give the business different options in terms of responding to business need at the right time. And I think the external market in terms of technology is awash with new technologies that help us to understand these things in new and different ways. You've got startups like Fathom that look at all of those things like risk of automation and skills adjacencies and what that looks like reflected into your own organization, so that you can start to think about, if you do have populations at risk, what are the different ways that you could execute that work. I think it's a really interesting and slowly evolving part of the practice that we have right now. But again, I think we're so early into this new normal that I don't have the answer yet. Which again is, I guess, why it keeps being so exciting working in this part of the world, eh?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to emphasize a point, because this data is out there. I believe it's out there because people have wanted to brand themselves. They wanted to market themselves. They understand that there's going to be a benefit coming back to them. So if that's the case, and one of the struggles historically has been, if I have an HR system and I have employee cards or something like that, very few people filled them out, even fewer kept them up to date. So now there's this data set out there that people have an interest in making accurate, keeping up to date. So, Courtney, given that you're new in role, and given that the world is shifting, it's been disrupted, arguably it creates a kind of greenfield site, to use that term, where you can reprioritize and create something totally new. And I'm not saying that you're going to do that, but what I am saying is that if you agree with that, what would you like to emerge? And I understand you're figuring it out, but if we fast forward, 6, 12 months with all these systems and data that are out there, what's the ideal future state? What processes would you like to see in place, and who would you like taking what action? For me, and just to seed it, right now, talent acquisition's over here, development's over here, comp's over here, and very rarely is there, good governance around how to use it. But and going to your earlier point, having this holistic view, might be better. So, again, without going on further, how are you thinking about the ideal future state and using tools like talent intelligence?
I certainly feel like it's a part of my job. And I don't think it's necessarily integrated in every people analytics team. So I do see that as part of the future vision, and in part because of this one point. Now that we're faced with this new reality, attrition is going to go down, right? So that there's a scenario there that's actually a known input. I think there's many unknown inputs, and there's probably way more scenarios than we had before, right? Maybe there was A, B, and C. Now there's A through Z, perhaps. But we know that there are actually certain things that are probably pretty solid, and that's people aren't necessarily going to leave their jobs in the same way that they were before. So how can I use that as a people analytics leader and data like that or information like that to collaborate with workforce planning, talent acquisition, and integrate in a way that we haven't in the past? And that is certainly a vision for the future, in part because it also incorporates the business, right, and business needs. And we're not just focused on HR for HR, but we're really broadening the strategy, right, and the strategic thinking.
Yeah, that's exactly. Toby, similar question to you insofar, what's your ideal future state? I mean, you mentioned that you're looking at total workforce, but who's the audience? Because I imagine we're all striving to improve, and I have seen, as I know Jordan has, is many companies talk about it. They'll have a workforce planning initiative, start and stops. It's suboptimal. They get frustrated, what have you. But what would you like to see? What are you striving for? What would you like to? Who would be at the table, and what changes would ensue?
Yeah, great question. So I see there almost being two different avenues for talent intelligence at the moment. I see the route where it's more talent analytics and it's looking at the recruitment funnel, it's looking at the sources of hire, the effectiveness of hire, the workforce planning, that sort of piece. And I could see that aligning very closely with people analytics, HR analytics. At the moment, I think there's a lot of functions that are still split. I could see that all merging, come together at some point in the future. I think there's also another arm, which is what I'd call talent intelligence, which doesn't necessarily look at things in the same way and isn't necessarily looking to even address the same questions. And I think that can work much closer with, say, marketing intelligence or strategy or an M&A teams. And it's much more around having a commercial intelligence arm where the purpose of that function isn't around hiring better. It isn't around hiring more effectively. It's around using labour market data for commercial gain and for value add. And I think that's the piece where I could see ultimately there being a centralized intelligence function within organizations where you may have marketing intelligence, competitor intelligence, talent intelligence, cyber intelligence, business intelligence. We've got a real estate intelligence team. There's a lot of transferable skills there. And I think having one holistic intel function where you have all that knowledge management, you have a transparency that runs across, I think that could be a really fascinating direction as well. So you almost have two different arms. The analytics piece, where you're going to be pushing much more towards the self-serve. I know yesterday you were talking about the analytics maturity model. I could see that following that model very closely, where you're looking to get the data to the decision makers very, very quickly and self-serve a lot of it. But then having the intel piece where it's much more consultative and you don't necessarily want that data in the hands of the end user to self-serve because you want to take them through that journey. You want to be consultative. And I could almost see two different directions developing.
Yeah, well, thanks for that. Again, Jordan, what are your thoughts? What's your ideal future state? I mean, who's your audience and what changes would you like them to adopt, particularly in the wake of COVID-19?
Yeah, I think I probably echo some of Toby's thoughts as well, actually. Like there is certainly a space that I think that we've been building towards for years in the analytics world that is far more of a joined up enterprise-wide analytics group that puts business intelligence type information into the hands of decision makers, and so I absolutely think that as humans we become generically more data savvy, more willing to go and access these pieces of information to support our own decision making. That will happen. Around the intelligence space, centralizing, I don't know. I think that there's something to be said for the domain expertise that financial controllers bring to the use of financial data in making those decisions, that people analytics people bring to the use of intelligence in making HR strategy decisions and that sort of stuff. So I don't know. What I do think is on the horizon and what I do think we will progress towards is a place where we far more regularly combine the idea of employee experience, whatever that employee looks like, and is it a traditional employee at a big enterprise that's hired and then retires, or is it a person in the gig economy that's jumping from employer to employer? Who can say? But I think we'll move to a place where that employee experience becomes incredibly important to be incredibly personalized. And I wonder if the COVID experience is going to speed that up, in that we will see the nature of work changing as a result of the way that we need to work. I think we have so much data, both inside our organizations and external to our organizations, that we have such an amazing opportunity to really tailor what we as employers offer to the people who work for and with us, to tailor their own experience of working with us, to tailor their own experience of HR, to tailor their own experience of remuneration and benefits and all of that sort of stuff, the way that they engage with the business, the way that they engage with their teams. And I think that really nailing that is what's going to enable that connection between people and delivering business outcomes at the other end. And I really continue to be quite optimistic that day is coming at us faster and faster. And I really suspect that these current times will see us accelerate towards that point as new employees' expectations of working with us change. because we're all thinking about it, right? We want to be safe constantly. We want to be not exposed, and we want to choose an employer that helps us to make sure that that's something that we get.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. Is that the contract that we as employers have with workers, and some of these situations obviously aren't good depending on industry. And so what we've seen is people analytics teams, as I spoke about yesterday morning, really elevate in prominence and visibility, and they're helping affect change. And others have been not pushed to the side. Maybe that might be too drastic, but they have not achieved that. And there's been kind of this breaking point. And a lot of times it's based on they've had the internal equity built up. They've had process already established. So Courtney, as we go back to you, what do you think needs to happen, particularly with skills and just the nature of work? So if I'm an individual and I have a certain skills listed on LinkedIn, for example, and I, however, am shifting what I can do because now with COVID, I'm working at home. I might have gotten laid off, and I realized that what I had done historically might not be what I am interested or able to do moving forward. So therefore, I have to shift, and so my personal brand doesn't accurately reflect my intentions. So what I'm getting at is that there are some maybe data that might not be as accurate as we'd like to hope. So how would you account for that? Do you put a asterisk next to a lot of these insights that you look at yourself, or you present internally, or how do you deal with the ambiguity in the data?
It's a great question. I'm thinking about what Josh Burson said yesterday, and how, I think he said this yesterday, how learning has increased exponentially in the last 6 to 8 weeks internally, but I'm sure externally as well. People are using the time that they have, right, to upskill. Hopefully they will take it upon themselves as individuals to update wherever they need to, internally and externally. And maybe there needs to be a campaign around that to ensure that people are representing the most up-to-date skill set they have. I know Josh also said something about survey vendors being surprised at the uptick in surveys as well. There are many listening opportunities going on from my perspective. I'll be hearing what Colgate employees are saying in this new space that they're working in, and hopefully being able to communicate back based on what we hear, some advice, right, on how employees can refocus.
Yeah, and because I couldn't agree more with what Josh said, and it was actually, I shouldn't say that. I was actually surprised, but after reflection, I couldn't agree more, because there is going to be rapid cycle change in how people are going to adopt new skills, because they're going to want to be employed, right? So Toby, as we start to wrap up now, we have about 6 minutes. A question just came in, which I think is a really good one. And Nick, I see yours too, which is good. What top 3 business questions do you believe talent intelligence could support? We might just go, in the interest of time, what 2 questions do you think they would answer? Toby, what do you got?
Ultimately, it depends on the organization. For us, I can only really speak for Philips. Location is a huge one for us. So we've got 140 years of setting up a structure and a real estate base based around a manufacturing organization, and now we're shifting to a software first organization. So the real estate footprint, how people are actually engaging in that is massive for us. I think the biggest opportunity though is around commercializing talent intelligence. So if you think of the COVID situation, what we're going through now, I don't think it's even necessarily about the skills and what skills are in the market and what skills we can bring on board. I don't think the opportunity really is on that TA side of things. I think it's going to the business and saying, well, how can we use this opportunity to analyze competitors, to analyze what they're recruiting for, to analyze the locations they're recruiting into, to analyze the skills they're recruiting for, to understand their go-to-market strategies, to understand how they're looking to shift and to pivot as an organization, and how is that going to affect us as an organization. And I think to your point earlier around how do we get heard, particularly if we don't have that internal equity to fall back on. I think being commercially aware and understanding what are the business goals, what are the business drivers, growth is obviously going to be a big one. Being cost aware is also obviously going to be a big one. I think listening to your business and understanding what do they really, really want at the moment, and then finding the angle you need from a TI perspective to help address that. I think that's going to be the key.
Yeah, well said. How about you, Jordan? What are the 2 or 3 questions you believe talent intelligence can support?
I think for us, it's around identifying what the emerging skills in our industries are, and where we can find them, and whether we have them, and if we don't, where we can go and get them. And I think that's probably it's pretty consistent across the last period. In fact, like it's not just right now. It would be how is the landscape of capability and competency and skill set changing in the world that Nestle operates in, and if we don't have those skills and competencies and capabilities, how can we go and acquire them?
Yeah, well said. How about you, Courtney? Top 2 questions that talent intelligence can help answer.
Yeah, I'd have to piggyback on what Jordan said. I mean, obviously, finding the skills, where are they now? Because it may have shifted, right, from where they were before. But very, very broadly, how can we use the data that we now have access to mitigate risks? So risks to workforce planning. How can we understand what benefits we need to provide to the workforce as it's shifting, as a result of what we're going through right now, what we're experiencing. So very, very broadly, these kinds of questions will have to be answered. I think talent intelligence is one input into that. But I think there's many other inputs into risk mitigation and how essentially we'll have to change the relationship between the employer and the employee.
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to shift. And, I love that you all 3, and it's inherent in your answers, have what I would call, echoing Carol Dweck's construct of growth mindset. We are learning. We're in this place where we obviously have to. And that's where I want to bring this last question to you, because skills are great. However, everyone has to shift and learn very rapidly. So are you going to be looking, and this is going to be the final question, at individuals' interest or capability and capacity to learn? When you go and assess talent, whether it be systematically or individually, is that a value for you all there at Philips, Toby?
Absolutely.
The ability to learn, agility.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the ability to learn and unlearn and relearn. I think it's absolutely vital. I think it's something that's vital for us as organisations. It's only getting more important. I think the difficulty is going to be that the education systems aren't necessarily keeping up with what we need them to provide. So that will be interesting to see how that develops, particularly post-COVID, when they've had to work in such a different way and in a much more agile way. So it'll be very interesting to see how things develop over the next 5-10 years on that front.
Yeah, absolutely. Jordan?
Yeah, I mean, unsurprisingly, the answer is yes, right? Like we've all talked about learning agility for some time. I think to Toby's point, like the way that we've delivered learning, the way that we've delivered development in years gone by is potentially going to need to change, huh? Like we don't know how quickly we're going to be able to get back to classroom learning. And I don't know about you, but the idea of sitting in a multiple day Zoom meeting, learning to point and click in a new piece of analytics technology actually makes me want to hurt myself. So I think there's a definite need for us to think about how we leverage individuals' learning agility. Because if I had to just switch from classroom to it being delivered on Zoom, I would be significantly less agile than I might be rated otherwise.
Jordan, you made my heart go like this, because you and I both remember the big binders that we had to go through. But Courtney, and I don't mean to be trite, it's like this talent intelligence could be great, but it's is it going to accurately reflect who somebody is? And so, what are your thoughts on learning agility? Has been a word for a long time, but I'm still shocked at how little we understand about who actually has the capability and capacity to learn over time. So is that something that's of high value to you there at Colgate?
Yes, learning and learning measurement is a huge focus area. I think so far we've been able to pivot a lot of learning, obviously online, and we'll continue to do so, but maybe not the 3 days where people want to hurt themselves. So we have to figure out another way to make that happen. But I think that learning and measuring not only, of course, the Kirkpatrick model and understanding the smell sheets, but how are people behaving differently as a result of learning, and what is that impacting, right, is part of the measurement strategy. And also, even, for example, the summer intern programs, right? I've talked to a number of organizations about their intern programs. Most have pivoted to fully virtual internship programs this summer, as have we. And I think that's also a learning opportunity, right, for the interns themselves, but also for us. And so we'll need to quickly figure out how that's going to work.
Well, Courtney, Toby, Jordan, thank you for sharing. Thank you for being part of the community. Thanks for the kind words that you've shared, as well as the insights you've shared today. So you all stay well, and hope to see you in person very soon. Yeah.
You
You
too.
too. Thank you
Thanks,
very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.